30,000 feet above Germany. The air is cold enough to freeze your blood, and the empty sky is an unforgiving graveyard. It is the bitter autumn of 1944. You are strapped inside the cramped, freezing aluminum cage of a P-51 Mustang, a massive Merlin engine, screaming right at your boots. Suddenly, the radio crackles with pure terror. A massive swarm of Luftwaffe fighters is dropping directly from the sun. Outnumbered and outgunned, a 21-year-old kid named Chuck Yeager is about to enter a 26-minute crucible of fire. Before we dive into this impossible true survival story, hit that subscribe button and like this video. Let's ride straight into the chaos. The damp, bone-chilling fog of the English countryside clung to Leiston Airfield like a wet wool blanket. It was 0300 hours, and the darkness was absolute, save for the harsh, yellow beams of flashlights cutting through the mist. Inside the corrugated metal Nissen huts, the men of the 357th Fighter Group were being unceremoniously ripped from their sleep. There were no gentle wake-ups in the 8th Air Force. There was only the rough shake of an orderly's hand, and the grim realization that today, some of the beds in this room would remain empty. Among the men dragging themselves out of their cots was Charles Elwood Yeager, a 21-year-old flight officer with a heavy West Virginia drawl and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Yeager wasn't like the polished, college-educated officers that populated much of the Army Air Forces. He was a mechanic first, a guy who understood the soul of an engine before he ever learned to fly one. That intuitive understanding of machinery made him dangerous in the cockpit. Breakfast was the usual grim affair. Powdered eggs that tasted like sulfur, burnt bacon, and coffee thick enough to patch a runway. The mess hall was filled with a low, tense murmuring. To Yeager's left sat his closest friend and wingman, Clarence Bud Anderson, a pilot of exceptional skill who flew a Mustang named Old Crow. The banter between them was light, masking the heavy reality of what awaited them. They didn't talk about the odds. They didn't talk about the flak. They talked about cars back home, about girls, about anything other than the red ribbon pinned to the map in the briefing room. The briefing room itself smelled of stale tobacco smoke, damp leather, and raw adrenaline. At the front, the intelligence officer pulled back a heavy curtain to reveal a massive map of Europe. A collective groan, hastily stifled, rippled through the seated pilots. The thick red ribbon stretched from the coast of England, straight over the treacherous English Channel, deep into the industrial heartland of Germany. The target was a heavy ball-bearing plant, heavily defended by the Luftwaffe. "Gentlemen," the commanding officer, Donald Bochke, announced, his voice carrying easily over the shuffle of boots. "The big friends are hitting the hornet's nest today. Intel suggests the Luftwaffe has pulled fighter squadrons from the Eastern Front to protect this sector. You can expect heavy resistance. Focke-Wulf 190S and Messerschmitt Bf 109S. They will be waiting for you to drop your guard. Do not leave the bombers. I repeat, do not abandon the bombers to chase stragglers." Yeager jotted down the radio frequencies and rally points on his kneeboard. He knew the doctrine. Escort duty meant staying chained to the slow, lumbering B-17 flying fortresses. It was a defensive posture that chafed at the aggressive instincts of a born fighter pilot, but it was what kept the bomber boys alive. Stepping out onto the flight line, the roar of engines was deafening. The ground crews had been up all night preparing the aircraft. Yeager walked toward his ship, a gleaming P-51D Mustang with the name Glamorous Glen 3 painted on the nose in honor of his girlfriend, Glennis. Waiting for him was his crew chief, Staff Sergeant Thomas Farr. Farr was a wizard with a wrench, a man who treated the Mustang with more reverence than he treated most people. "She's running a little rich on the left bank, Chuck, but I tuned her up," Farr shouted over the din of a dozen other engines turning over. "Guns are armed, drop tanks are topped off. Bring her back in one piece, will you?" "I always do, Tommy," Yeager grinned, clapping the crew chief on the shoulder, before scrambling up the wing route and dropping into the cramped utilitarian cockpit. The cockpit of a P-51 was no place for claustrophobia. It was a tight cage of dials, switches, and exposed wiring. Yeager strapped himself into the parachute harness, secured the heavy lap belts, and plugged in his radio and oxygen lines. He ran through his pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision. Flaps set. Trim tabs neutral. Fuel selector on the main tank. He pumped the primer, hit the starter switch, and the massive 1,490 horsepower Packard V16507 Merlin engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with an earth-shaking bellow. A massive cloud of blue exhaust smoke engulfed the ground crew. The airframe vibrated with violent, suppressed energy. This aircraft wasn't just a machine. It was the pinnacle of Allied aeronautical engineering, a thoroughbred warhorse, capable of outrunning and outturning almost anything the Axis could put in the sky. As the control tower flashed the green light, Yeager eased the throttle forward. Glamorous Glen 3 trundled onto the perforated steel plating of the runway. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and external drop tanks, the Mustang felt heavy and sluggish. Taking off in a fully laden P-51 was a delicate balancing act. Yeager lined up, locked the tail wheel, and smoothly pushed the throttle to the firewall. The acceleration pushed him back into his seat. The tail lifted, and with a final, shuddering bump, the heavy fighter broke the bonds of gravity, slicing upward into the overcast English sky. The hunt had begun. Climbing through the dense cloud layer, the 357th Fighter Group formed up. Yeager looked out of his bubble canopy, checking his wing. Bud Anderson's Old Crow was right there, tucked in tight, rising and falling on the invisible air currents like a shadow. Around them, dozens of silver Mustangs caught the first gleaming rays of the morning sun as they broke through the overcast layer at 15,000 feet. It was a breathtakingly beautiful sight, a stark contrast to the ugly business they were flying toward. The climb continued relentlessly to 30,000 feet. Up here, the environment itself was trying to kill them. The temperature plummeted to 50 degrees below zero. The aluminum walls of the cockpit radiated a deep, agonizing cold that seeped through Yeager's fleece-lined leather jacket, through his heated flight suit, straight into his bones. Condensation froze on the inside of the canopy, requiring him to constantly scrape it away with his gloved hand just to see outside. Every breath was a conscious effort. The oxygen mask was clamped tightly over his nose and mouth, delivering dry, metallic-tasting air. If the oxygen system failed up here, hypoxia would set in within minutes, followed swiftly by unconsciousness and a fatal plunge to the earth. Rendezvous point in 2 minutes. Yoxford, the group leader's voice crackled over the radio, using the 357th's call sign. Ahead of them, the sky was filled with contrails, long, pure white ribbons of condensed vapor left behind by the massive engines of the heavy bombers. As Yeager strained his eyes, the specks at the end of the contrails resolved into the unmistakable shapes of B-17 flying fortresses. There were hundreds of them, stacked in tight, staggered combat boxes. They looked like a majestic, terrifying armada of silver whales swimming through an ocean of thin blue air. "Look at the big friends," Anderson's voice came over the radio, sounding thin and tinny. "Beautiful day for a parade." "Keep your eyes peeled, Bud," Yeager replied, scanning the empty sky above them. "The Krauts know they're coming." The Mustangs took up their positions, weaving back and forth above the bomber formations. They had to weave because the bombers cruised at around 160 miles per hour, while the Mustangs would stall if they flew that slowly. The weaving pattern allowed them to maintain their airspeed and keep their energy up, ready to pounce at a moment's notice. As they crossed the coast of mainland Europe, the grim reality of the war asserted itself. The sky ahead erupted in violent bursts of black smoke. Flak. The German anti-aircraft gunners were waiting for them. The explosion sent shockwaves through the thin air, buffeting the heavy bombers and the agile fighters alike. Yeager watched in tight-lipped silence as a flak shell detonated directly beneath the wing of a B-17, a few miles ahead. The bomber shuddered violently, its number 3 engine bursting into a spectacular plume of bright orange flame. The pilot desperately tried to maintain formation, but the damage was too severe. The massive aircraft slowly banked away, dropping out of the protective box, becoming a straggler. 10 parachutes blossomed in the freezing air, tiny white specks against the dark earth below. Yeager wanted to dive down, to protect the crippled bomber, but his orders were absolute. They had to stay with the main formation. A straggler veit, and the Luftwaffe knew it. The tension in the cockpit was suffocating. Every pilot was swiveling his head constantly. The fighter pilots swivel, knowing that the man who saw the enemy first usually lived. They were looking for the telltale glint of sunlight on a canopy, the slight smudge of exhaust smoke against the horizon, anything that indicated the presence of the enemy. For an hour, there was nothing but the steady drone of the Merlin engine, the biting cold, and the terrifying wall of black flak. They were deep into German airspace now, far beyond the range of radar support from England. They were entirely on their own. Then, the radio exploded with panicked chatter. Bogies. 10 o'clock high. Coming out of the sun, Yeager snapped his head back, looking up through the top of his canopy. For a second, the blinding glare of the sun washed out everything. Then, his eyes adjusted, and his stomach plummeted. They weren't bogies. They were bandits, and there were dozens of them. It was a classic Luftwaffe ambush. They had used the sun to mask their approach, climbing high above the bomber stream, waiting for the perfect moment to execute a diving attack. Yeager recognized the blunt, aggressive silhouettes of Focke-Wulf 190s, heavily armored and armed to the teeth with 20mm cannons designed to shred the bombers. Behind them, sleeker, faster, Messerschmitt Bf 109s provided top cover. "Drop tanks! Drop tanks!" the squadron leader yelled. Yeager reached down and yanked the release lever. He felt the Mustang surge upwards, instantly lighter and more responsive, as the heavy, drag-inducing external fuel tanks tumbled away into the void. He shoved the throttle, engaging the war emergency power. The engine screamed, the manifold pressure gauge pegging at the red line. Yoxford, engage. The sky, which had been peacefully empty moments before, instantly devolved into a chaotic, swirling maelstrom of violence. The closing speed between the diving German fighters and the ascending American Mustangs was nearly 1,000 miles an hour. There was no time to think, only to react with sheer, instinctual muscle memory. Yeager pulled back hard on the stick, throwing glamorous Glen 3 into a steep climbing turn. The G-forces hit him like a physical blow, pressing him deep into the seat, draining the blood from his head, narrowing his vision to a dark tunnel. He grunted, tightening his stomach muscles, fighting off the gray-out. Tracers, glowing a sickening, bright green, streaked past his canopy, missing him by inches. The sound of his own 6.50 caliber machine guns firing was a deafening, vibrating roar that shook the entire airframe. A Focke-Wulf 190 flashed across his nose. Yeager didn't even use his gyroscopic gun sight. He aimed purely by instinct, pulling lead on the enemy fighter and squeezing the trigger on the stick. A lethal stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds stitched across the FWF 190's engine cowling. Pieces of metal tore away, glittering in the sunlight. The German plane violently snapped, rolled to the right, trailing thick, black glycol smoke, diving away from the fight. "Got him," Yeager muttered under his breath, his eyes instantly darting, looking for his next target. The sky was a terrifying, beautiful chaos. Bombers were desperately trying to maintain formation, while fighters weaved and slashed through their ranks. Parachutes, debris, and burning aircraft fell through the freezing air like grim confetti. The radio was a wall of noise, screams, curses, urgent warnings, and the staccato bark of static. "Break right, bud! Break right!" Yeager shouted, seeing a Bf 109 sliding onto Anderson's tail. Anderson rolled his Mustang inverted and pulled through, narrowly escaping a burst of cannon fire. The maneuver separated them. In a dogfight, losing your wingman was the fastest way to get killed. Yeager instinctively turned to follow Anderson, to cover his friend. But the sky was too congested. Suddenly, a massive shudder ripped through glamorous Glen 3. Yeager heard a terrifying whump, whump, whump. The unmistakable sound of high-explosive 20mm cannon shells detonating against his right wing. The Mustang violently yawed to the right. He looked back over his shoulder. 2 Focke-Wulf 196 had dropped from the clouds, perfectly bracketing him. They were seasoned pilots, flying in a disciplined tactical spread, trapping him in a lethal crossfire. Yeager shoved the stick forward and kicked the rudder, throwing the Mustang into a violent, skidding dive to break their tracking. The maneuver worked momentarily, throwing off the German's aim, but he traded crucial altitude for airspeed. He was now below the main furball, isolated, and rapidly losing the tactical advantage of height. As he pulled out of the dive, checking his 6 o'clock, his blood ran cold. The 2 FEU 190s were still there, staying relentlessly on his tail. But they weren't alone anymore. From the chaotic, swirling mass of fighters above, 4 more Messerschmitt Bf 109s peeled off, recognizing a solitary, wounded American fighter. They swooped down like sharks, smelling blood in the water. 6 heavily armed Luftwaffe fighters. One lone, damaged P-51 Mustang. Yeager checked his instruments. His right wing was peppered with holes, increasing drag and making the plane sluggish to the right. His fuel was dropping rapidly due to the emergency power settings. He was 300 miles deep in enemy territory. If he bailed out, he would be captured or killed by angry German civilians before his boots even hit the ground. Running wasn't an option. 6 fighters would simply run him down from behind. Climbing was suicide. They would shoot him out of the sky as he lost airspeed. There was only one way out. He had to turn and fight. He had to enter the very jaws of the trap and tear his way through. Chuck Yeager gritted his teeth, feeling the icy sweat prickle against the back of his neck under the heavy leather helmet. He chopped the throttle back, dropped his combat flaps, and aggressively hauled the control stick into his lap, pulling the Mustang into the tightest, most violent, bone-crushing turn the airframe could withstand. He wasn't trying to escape anymore. He was taking the fight directly to them. The 26-minute nightmare had just begun. To turn back into a pursuing enemy force is an act of aerodynamic defiance that borders on the suicidal. The standard doctrine, drilled into every Allied pilot from the sprawling plains of Texas to the muddy airfields of England, dictated that a solitary, outnumbered fighter should push the throttle to the firewall, put the nose down, and use the sheer, unmatched diving speed of the P-51 Mustang to escape to the west. But Flight Officer Chuck Yeager wasn't flying by the manual. He was flying by the visceral, instinctive rhythm of a man who understood that turning away from a pack of predators only triggered their instinct to chase and kill. As Yeager hauled the control stick back into his stomach, the massive Packard Merlin engine roared in protest. He reached down and deployed his combat flaps, a dangerous gamble at this airspeed. The sudden deployment of the flaps disrupted the smooth airflow over the wings, acting as an immense air brake that shoved him violently forward against his shoulder harnesses, but it artificially increased the lift of the Mustang. This allowed glamorous Glen 3 to turn inside a radius that theoretically should have snapped its wings clean off. The G-forces hit him with the crushing weight of a falling safe. Blood instantly rushed from his brain, pooling heavily in his legs. His vision narrowed into a dark, pulsing tunnel, the colors draining away until the world was rendered in terrifying shades of gray. Yeager clamped his jaw shut, violently constricting his abdominal muscles, and grunting rhythmically a crude, desperate method to force the oxygen-starved blood back up into his skull. He was pulling over 6 Gs. The heavy aluminum frame of the Mustang groaned and popped around him, the rivets screaming under the immense torsional strain. Coming out of the impossibly tight turn, He wasn't running. He was face to face with the lead Focke-Wulf 190. The closing speed of the head-on pass was nearly 1,000 miles per hour. It was a terrifying game of aerial chicken, where a flinch meant death, and holding course meant a mid-air collision that would vaporize both aircraft. The few 190's wings lit up with the staccato, blinding flashes of its 420mm cannons. Green tracer rounds, the size of milk bottles, zipped past Yeager's canopy so close he could hear the supersonic crack of their passage over the roar of his own engine. Yeager didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the glowing reticle of his K-14 gyroscopic gun sight. He trusted his eyes and his hands. He depressed the trigger on the stick. The 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, housed in the Mustang's wings, erupted, spitting out a staggering 75 rounds per second. The cockpit instantly filled with the acrid, sulfurous stench of burnt cordite. A solid hose of armor-piercing incendiary rounds slammed directly into the blunt, armored nose of the Focke-Wulf. Yeager watched with clinical detachment as his bullets chewed through the German fighter's engine cowling. Pieces of shattered aluminum and red-hot steel tore away, glittering briefly in the frigid sunlight. The massive BMW radial engine of the few 190 seized violently, vomiting a geyser of thick black oil and white glycol coolant straight into the slipstream. The German pilot violently yanked his stick sideways, desperately breaking off the attack as his engine choked and died. The crippled full 190 snapped into a flat spin, trailing a mile-long ribbon of black smoke as it plummeted toward the German countryside, 30,000 feet below. Yeager didn't stick around to watch for a parachute. 1 down, 5 to go. But the moment of triumph was fleeting. The sheer violence of his maneuver had bled away his kinetic energy. His airspeed indicator was dropping perilously close to the stall margin. He was hanging in the sky, slow and vulnerable, exactly where the remaining Luftwaffe pilots wanted him. The 4 sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109s, recognizing his vulnerable state, attacked in a beautifully coordinated, terrifyingly lethal formation. They didn't engage in a turning fight where the Mustang could match them. They used their superior altitude and climb rate to initiate a series of boom and zoom attacks. They would dive from the sun, take a high-deflection snapshot at the silver American fighter, and use the energy of their dive to climb back up out of range before Yeager could bring his guns to bear. It was an exhausting, agonizing, defensive dance. Yeager was forced into a continuous, desperate Luftbrücke circle of 1. He threw the heavy Mustang into violent, skidding turns, slipping and sliding through the thin air, never flying in a straight line for more than 2 seconds. He was operating entirely on instinct, violently kicking the rudder pedals and throwing the stick from corner to corner. The physical toll was immense. Sweat poured down his face, freezing almost instantly against the rubber edge of his oxygen mask. His arms ached with a deep, burning lactic acid fire from fighting the heavy, unboosted controls at high speeds. Then, disaster struck. As he rolled hard to the left to evade a diving 109, one of the trailing 4 190s managed to pull enough lead. Yeager heard a terrifying crack thump directly behind his head. A 20mm high-explosive Meningachos shell detonated against the thick armor plating behind his seat. The concussive shockwave punched him in the spine, rattling his teeth and knocking the wind out of his lungs. The instrument panel blurred as the Mustang violently shuddered. Shrapnel tore through the rear fuselage, severing several non-essential hydraulic lines. A piece of jagged steel, the size of a silver dollar, ricocheted through the cockpit, shattering the left side of his plexiglass bubble canopy. Instantly, the pressurized, relatively warm air of the cockpit was sucked out into the void. A roaring, 50-degree below zero hurricane blasted into the enclosed space. The noise was deafening, a relentless, shrieking howl that drowned out even the mighty Merlin engine. Ice crystals immediately began to form on the exposed dials and the edges of Yeager's flight goggles. Glamorous Glenn, this is Nookie Bookie. What is your situation? We see a furball low. Over. The voice of Captain Leonard Kit Carson, one of the 357th's leading aces, cut through the static on the radio. Help was somewhere up there, miles above the cloud deck. But Yeager couldn't take his left hand off the throttle quadrant to key the microphone button. If he backed off the power for even a fraction of a second, the pursuing Germans would close the gap and execute him. He was entirely alone, trapped in a freezing, howling metal coffin, fighting for his life. Through the shattered canopy, Yeager tracked a Bf-109, pulling out of its dive, attempting to climb back to its perch. The German pilot, perhaps overconfident or blinded by the sun, made a fatal, fractional error. He didn't climb aggressively enough, flattening his trajectory for a moment to check his mirrors. It was all the opening Yeager needed. Ignoring the screaming wind and the freezing cold tearing at his face, Yeager slammed the throttle to the firewall, engaging the war emergency power override. A wire snapped against his hand as he pushed the lever past its mechanical stop. The Merlin engine screamed in agony, manifold pressure spiking well into the red zone. The Mustang surged forward, vibrating violently as it chewed through the thin air. Yeager pulled the nose up, ignoring the gyroscopic gun sight entirely. He was tracking the target visually, estimating the deflection, feeling the geometry of the shot in his bones. He led the ascending Messerschmitt by 2 plane lengths and squeezed the trigger. The 4 remaining functional .50 calibers roared. A steady stream of red tracers arced beautifully through the freezing sky, intersecting perfectly with the flight path of the Bf-109. The armor-piercing rounds sawed through the thin aluminum wing root of the German fighter. The results were catastrophic and instantaneous. The structural integrity of the wing failed under the extreme aerodynamic load of the climb. The entire right wing of the Messerschmitt folded upward with a sickening snap, tearing cleanly away from the fuselage. The crippled fighter violently cartwheeled into an uncontrollable, dizzying spin, a horrifying blur of metal and leaking fuel, spiraling down toward the earth. 2 down, 4 to go. But the victory was Pyrrhic. Glamorous Glen 3 was bleeding. The control surfaces felt heavy and sluggish. The right wing was riddled with holes, increasing drag and requiring constant, exhausting pressure on the left rudder pedal just to fly straight. And worse, the war emergency power was cooking the engine. The temperature gauges were slowly, inexorably creeping toward the danger zone. Yeager couldn't survive another 10 minutes in this high-altitude arena. He was bleeding energy, outgunned, and his plane was slowly tearing itself apart. He had to change the rules of the engagement. He had to drag them down into the weeds. Taking a deep breath of dry, metallic oxygen, Flight Officer Chuck Yeager inverted the crippled P-51 Mustang, pulled back on the stick, and pointed the nose straight down toward the dark, forested heart of Germany. The descent was a terrifying, vertical plummet that defied every instinct of self-preservation. From 30,000 feet, the patchwork fields and dense, black forests of the German landscape rushed up to meet glamorous Glen 3 with dizzying speed. The Mustang dropped like a stone. In a full vertical dive, the overloaded fighter screamed past 400 miles per hour, then faster, pushing the edge of its limits. The damaged airframe wailed under the strain, metal trembling as if it might tear apart at any second. Wind tore through the shattered canopy, slamming into Yeager's face with freezing, needle-sharp force. At 15,000 feet, the aircraft began to betray him. The nose grew heavy, unnaturally heavy, dragging downward as the controls stiffened. The stick felt locked in place. Yeager braced both feet, both arms straining, forcing it back inch by inch just to keep the plane from plunging straight into the earth. Behind him, the German fighters followed, 4 of them dropping in tight pursuit. At 2,000 feet, he made his move. The pullout came slow, precise, unforgiving. Too hard, and the weakened wing would snap. Too soft, and he'd die on impact. The G-forces crushed him into the seat, stealing his breath as the ground surged upward. Trees, fields, rooftops snapping into focus. Then, level, barely 100 feet above the ground. Now the real danger began. At that speed, that altitude, there was no room for error. One mistake, a hill, a wire, a misjudged turn, and it would be over instantly. But this was where Yeager thrived. Up high, numbers mattered. Down here, it was instinct. He tore across the landscape, the Mustang roaring low and fast, shockwaves rattling rooftops and scattering livestock. The Germans followed, spreading out to trap him. The air turned rough, violent. The damaged plane bucked and shuddered, but Yeager held it steady, hands moving constantly, adjusting, correcting, fighting both the machine and the terrain. Eyes forward, then back, always watching, always calculating. Down here, it wasn't just a dogfight. It was survival. The Germans were relentless. Tracers occasionally zipped past his wings, chewing into the dirt and shattering trees ahead of him. But hitting a jinking, erratic target, traveling at over 400 miles an hour at treetop level, was nearly impossible. Yeager realized he needed to use the environment as his wingman. He spotted a narrow, winding river, likely a tributary of the Elbe, cutting a deep, jagged gorge through a heavily wooded ridge. Without hesitation, he slammed the Mustang into a knife-edge bank, dropping the left wing so low it almost clipped the surface of the rushing water, and hauled the plane into the treacherous ravine. The two Bf-109s, lighter and more agile, banked sharply to follow him into the narrow cut. The two heavier Fu-190s pulled up, deciding to stay high and cap the gorge, waiting to pounce when he inevitably popped out the other side. Inside the ravine, the dogfight descended into pure madness. The rock walls towered 100 feet above them, on either side. Yeager was flying a slalom course through a canyon of solid stone, reacting with split-second reflexes to every bend and outcropping. The roar of the Merlin engine, echoing off the rock walls, was an apocalyptic thunder. The lead Bf-109 pushed hard, the pilot desperate to close the distance before Yeager slipped away. The German pilot was good, incredibly good, matching Yeager's terrifying maneuvers turn for turn. But the German didn't know the limits of his machine at this specific altitude and speed, quite like Yeager did. Approaching a sharp, blind hairpin turn in the river, Yeager chopped his throttle back just a fraction and kicked his rudder hard, skidding the Mustang through the turn, purposefully bleeding off speed. The Bf-109 pilot, fixated entirely on the silver target in his sights, reacted a microsecond too late to the sudden deceleration. Realizing he was going to overshoot and crash into the rock wall, the German panicked and yanked back on his control stick, trying to pull up and out of the gorge. At that speed, in a turn that tight, the aerodynamic laws of physics were unforgiving. The Bf-109 underwent a violent, high-speed, accelerated stall. The left wing simply stopped producing lift. The sleek German fighter snapped aggressively onto its back, completely out of control. Yeager didn't even have to fire a shot. He felt the massive, concussive thump vibrate through his airframe as the Messerschmitt slammed inverted into the solid granite wall of the ravine, instantly detonating into a massive ball of orange flame and black smoke. 3 down, 3 to go. Yeager blasted out of the gorge, leaving the fiery wreckage behind, only to find a new, terrifying problem staring him in the face from the instrument panel. The coolant temperature gauge, which had been creeping up since the high-altitude fight, was now pegged firmly in the red. The oil pressure was fluctuating wildly. The violent maneuvers in the gorge had stressed the damaged systems to their absolute breaking point. A stray piece of shrapnel from earlier in the fight had definitely nicked the belly radiator. Glamorous Glen 3 was bleeding its lifeblood into the slipstream. A heavy, metallic knocking sound began to emanate from the front of the aircraft. The massive Packard Merlin engine was beginning to overheat and seize. The vibration shook the control stick so violently it bruised Yeager's hands. He had, at best, 5 minutes of engine life remaining before the massive V12 turned into a solid block of fused, useless metal. He glanced up in his mirror. The second BF, 109, had wisely pulled up and out of the gorge before the hairpin turn. Now, it had rejoined the two Fuvl 190s. The three surviving German fighters reformed behind him, maintaining a cautious distance. They had watched him lead 3 of their comrades to their deaths. They weren't going to fall for any more tricks. They could see the thin trail of white vapor leaking from his belly. They knew he was dying. They were simply going to shadow him, wait for his engine to seize, and then shoot him to pieces as he tried to crash land. Yeager felt a cold, hard knot of pure adrenaline and frustration form in his stomach. He was out of altitude, rapidly running out of engine, and the ammo counters for his inboard guns showed empty. He only had a few dozen rounds left in the outboard, 50 calibers. The German countryside blurred past fields, a small village, a sprawling vineyard. Ahead, the terrain flattened out, offering no cover, no ravines to hide in. But rising starkly from the flat farmland was a massive, ancient stone viaduct, carrying a railway line high above a wide, shallow river valley. The stone arches were massive, built to last 1,000 years. It was a crazy, desperate idea. The kind of idea that gets pilots killed in training accidents. But Yeager had run out of sane options 10 minutes ago. He kept the Mustang low, flying straight toward the massive stone structure, purposefully keeping his speed steady, letting the lead Fuvl 190 close the gap. The German pilot, sensing the end was near, pushed his throttle forward, eager to claim the kill. The distance closed 500 yards, 400, 300. Yeager could clearly see the yellow spinner of the Focke-Wulf in his mirror, could almost see the pilot's eyes behind his goggles. The viaduct loomed massive in the windshield. A normal pilot would pull up to clear the stone bridge. The German pilot, anticipating this, raised his nose slightly, waiting for the Mustang to pop up into his crosshairs and expose its vulnerable belly. 50 yards from the viaduct, Yeager shoved the stick forward. He didn't go over the bridge. He went under it. Glamorous Glen 3 shrieked through the narrow gap between 2 massive stone pillars, the wingtips clearing the ancient masonry by mere feet. The roar of the dying Merlin engine echoed terrifyingly under the stone archway. The German pilot, utterly unprepared for this suicidal maneuver, reacted with pure, panicked instinct. He was too high to go under, and too fast to turn away. He violently hauled back on his stick to climb over the viaduct. The Fu 190 shot upward, clearing the railway tracks by inches. But the sudden, violent climb bled off massive amounts of airspeed. The heavy German fighter hung in the air above the bridge, teetering on the very edge of a stall. Yeager cleared the underside of the bridge, instantly pulled back on the stick, and executed a vicious, bone-jarring snap roll. As the world spun and righted itself, he found himself slightly above and directly behind the stalling Focke-Wulf 190. It was a perfect, beautifully orchestrated trap. The German fighter was wallowing, practically stationary in the air. Yeager didn't even need the gun sight. He depressed the trigger, praying to God there were bullets left in the outboard belts. The 50 calibers barked a short, furious burst, maybe 30 rounds in total before the guns fell completely silent with a hollow click, click, click. He was completely out of ammunition, but 30 rounds were enough. The heavy slugs tore directly into the unarmored underside of the FW-190's fuselage, instantly igniting the main fuel cell. The German fighter erupted into a spectacular, blinding fireball that briefly outshone the sun. The burning wreckage tumbled lazily out of the sky, splashing heavily into the shallow river below the viaduct. 4 down, Chuck Yeager blew out a long, ragged breath, his chest heaving under the heavy flight suit. The metallic knocking of his engine was now a violent, terrifying clatter. Smoke began to curl lazily from under the cowling, seeping into the cockpit. He was out of ammo. His plane was dying, and he was still hundreds of miles from home. He glanced into the rearview mirror. High above, silhouetted against the bright, freezing sky, the two remaining Luftwaffe fighters circled lazily. They had watched the absolute destruction of their squadron. They watched the crippled, smoking Mustang, limping away low over the river. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then, as if silently acknowledging they had seen enough ghosts for one day, the two German fighters banked sharply to the east, advancing the throttles and heading back toward the heart of the Reich, leaving the lone, battered American to whatever fate awaited him. The 26-minute nightmare was over, but the fight to get home had just begun. The silence that followed the departure of the two Messerschmitts was heavier in many ways than the deafening roar of the guns that had preceded it. It was a terrifying, fragile, quiet, broken only by the relentless, shrieking howl of the 50-degree below-zero wind tearing through the shattered plexiglass of the canopy, and the agonizing, metallic death rattle of the Packard Merlin engine. Flight Officer Chuck Yeager was alone again in the vast, hostile skies over Germany, but the adrenaline that had fueled his 26-minute dance with death was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a cold, crushing wave of absolute exhaustion. He was flying at barely 3,000 feet now, having coaxed the crippled, glamorous Glen 3 up from the deck to gain a marginal safety buffer against ground fire. The landscape below was a blur of dark, winter-bare forests and frozen agricultural fields, the heartland of a dying but still incredibly dangerous Third Reich. Every instinct, every ounce of training, screamed at him to climb, to get back to altitude, where he could use the thin air to extend his glide if the engine failed, and where he could establish radio contact with the bomber streams or the rescue relays. But altitude was a luxury he could no longer afford. The instrument panel in front of him was a glowing nightmare of warning signs. The main compass had been shattered by a piece of shrapnel during the initial high-altitude ambush, its fluid leaking down the fascia in a sticky, sweet-smelling mess. The coolant temperature gauge was pinned so far past the red line that the needle was vibrating against the physical stop of the dial. The oil pressure was fluctuating wildly, dropping perilously low before surging back up, a clear indication that the internal seals of the massive V-12 were failing, bleeding lubrication directly into the combustion chambers. Thick, acrid gray smoke was steadily seeping up through the floorboards, filling the cockpit with the sickening stench of burning rubber, scorching oil, and hot, stressed metal. He had to manage the engine with the delicate touch of a surgeon operating on a failing heart. If he pushed the throttle forward even a fraction of an inch, the increased manifold pressure would instantly seize the pistons, turning the engine into a solid block of fused aluminum and steel. If he pulled the throttle back too far, he would lose airspeed, stall, and drop like a stone into the German countryside. He found a miserable, razor-thin equilibrium, a power setting just high enough to keep the Mustang flying at roughly 180 miles per hour, but low enough to delay the inevitable mechanical, catastrophic failure. At this speed, a P-51 is a wallowing, uncooperative beast. The right wing, chewed to ribbons by the 20mm Minengesho shells, was generating massive amounts of parasitic drag. The aircraft constantly wanted to roll and yaw to the right, dragging its nose toward the earth. To keep it flying straight and level, Yeager had to apply constant, heavy pressure to the left rudder pedal and hold the control stick firmly to the left. The hydraulic assist was completely dead, the line severed during the dogfight. He was fighting the raw, unmitigated aerodynamic forces of a 7,000-pound machine with nothing but the brute strength of his own muscles. Within 20 minutes, the physical toll became excruciating. The lactic acid buildup in his left leg and left arm felt like liquid fire. His muscles trembled violently, threatening to cramp and lock up. To relieve the pressure, he tried adjusting the elevator and rudder trim tabs, but the cables had been damaged. The wheels spun uselessly under his gloved fingers. He was trapped in a painful isometric hold, a wrestling match with a dying machine that he could not afford to lose for a single second. Adding to the agony was the profound, inescapable cold. The hole in the canopy, roughly the size of a dinner plate, acted as a funnel for the freezing slipstream. A localized blizzard of frost and ice crystals swirled continuously inside the cockpit. Yeager's breath froze instantly against the rubber edge of his oxygen mask, forming thick icicles that hung down to his chest. His fleece-lined leather flight jacket, entirely sufficient for a sealed, heated cockpit, was woefully inadequate against a direct 180-mile-per-hour blast of sub-zero air. He could no longer feel his toes inside his heavy, fleece-lined flying boots. His fingers, gripping the control stick and the throttle quadrant, were completely numb, operating purely on visual command and mechanical memory rather than sensation. He knew, with grim certainty, that frostbite was actively setting in, killing the tissue in his extremities. Without a working compass, navigation became an exercise in desperate dead reckoning and primitive orienteering. Yeager looked up through the scratched, frosted remnants of his canopy, locating the pale, watery winter sun. It was mid-afternoon. He kept the sun positioned off his left front quarter, a crude but effective method of flying generally west, toward the English Channel and the vague hope of salvation. He followed the winding path of a wide river. He guessed it was the Rhine, though the geography of the war-torn landscape was difficult to verify. The river was a natural navigational handrail, leading him toward the Low Countries and the coast. But it was also a heavily trafficked artery, protected by German anti-aircraft batteries. Suddenly, the dull, rhythmic thud of the dying engine was interrupted by the sharp, terrifying crack, crack, crack of light flak. Black puffs of smoke blossomed in the air off his left wing. He had drifted too close to a railway marshalling yard, hidden beneath a camouflage net of cut branches and netting. The German gunners, operating 37mm rapid-fire cannons, had spotted the low-flying, smoking Mustang and opened up. A healthy pilot in an intact fighter would have aggressively jinked, throwing the plane into violent, evasive maneuvers to spoil the gunner's aim. Yeager didn't have that luxury. If he banked hard, the damaged wing might snap, or the sudden aerodynamic load might finally kill the struggling engine. He had to sit there, gritting his teeth, holding his agonizingly slow course, and pray to the gods of probability. Shrapnel pattered against the aluminum skin of the fuselage like lethal hail. A piece of hot, jagged steel ripped through the right elevator, causing the control stick to kick violently in his hand. But the control cables miraculously held. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second, waiting for the fatal blow that would sever a fuel line or shatter the canopy entirely. But the barrage faded as he slowly, painfully crawled out of range, leaving the marshalling yard behind in the gray mist. As the hours dragged on, the psychological battle began to eclipse the physical pain. The extreme cold and the constant, throbbing vibration of the engine were inducing a dangerous state of lethargy. His eyelids grew impossibly heavy. The urge to simply let go of the stick, to close his eyes, and let the dark, freezing embrace of unconsciousness wash over him was overwhelming. It would be so easy. Just relax the cramping muscles. Let the nose drop, and the pain would be over in seconds. To fight off the creeping sleep of hypothermia, Yeager began to talk out loud. He yelled into the dead radio, his voice echoing hollowly inside the frozen oxygen mask. He cursed the German pilots who had ambushed him. He cursed the engineers at North American Aviation for not putting thicker armor plate behind the seat. He recited the firing order of a Merlin engine block. He talked to Bud Anderson, imagining his wingman flying in tight formation just out of sight in the clouds. He talked to his crew chief, Thomas Farr, apologizing for bringing glamorous Glen 3 back in such a disastrous state. He focused every ounce of his willpower on the singular, irreducible goal of surviving the next 60 seconds, and then the 60 seconds after that. Finally, after what felt like several lifetimes trapped in that agonizing, frozen purgatory, the landscape ahead began to change. The dark, rolling hills and dense forests of the European mainland gradually gave way to flat, marshy lowlands. The air grew perceptibly heavier, carrying the distinct, salty tang of the ocean. Yeager wiped a layer of frost from the front windscreen with the back of his numb, heavy glove. Ahead of him, stretching out to the hazy horizon, was a vast, unbroken expanse of slate-gray water, chopped into white-capped peaks by the winter wind. He had reached the coast of occupied Europe. He had made it to the English Channel. But as he looked down at the freezing, violent water and listened to the apocalyptic knocking of his engine, he realized that the most dangerous part of his journey had only just begun. The English Channel in the dead of winter is not merely a body of water. It is a sprawling, indifferent graveyard. To a downed aviator, life expectancy in those freezing swells was measured in a handful of agonizing minutes. There would be no rescue out here. The air-sea rescue launches could not operate effectively in these sea states, and a solitary fighter would never be spotted in the vast expanse of gray waves. If glamorous Glen 3 went down, Flight Officer Chuck Yeager would simply cease to exist. As the coastline of occupied France slipped behind his tail, the harsh reality of his situation crystallized. He was 80 miles from the English coast. The cockpit had become its own isolated survival nightmare, akin to being trapped in a high-altitude blizzard. The sub-zero wind howled through the shattered canopy, coating the instrument panel and Yeager's flight suit in a thick, blinding layer of white frost. He was freezing to death, his extremities completely numb, fighting a desperate battle against hypothermia while simultaneously trying to keep his crippled fighter airborne. 10 miles out over the water, the inevitable occurred. Deep within the heart of the engine, a main connecting rod, weakened by extreme heat and lack of lubrication, snapped under the immense stress. The broken rod flailed wildly, violently punching a hole through the side of the engine block. A massive plume of thick black smoke belched from the exhaust stacks, instantly blinding Yeager's forward vision. The four-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller came to a sudden, violent halt. The roaring beast that had carried him through hell was dead. The sudden absence of engine noise was profoundly eerie, leaving only the rushing sound of the wind shearing over the aluminum skin of the wings. Glamorous Glen 3 was no longer a state-of-the-art fighter. It was a 7,000-pound glider. Yeager shoved the nose down, trading altitude for airspeed to maintain kinetic energy above the stall margin. He established the optimal glide angle, stretching the descent as far as possible. But the mathematics were brutal. From 3,000 feet, he had perhaps 6 miles of forward travel. He was still over 70 miles from England. To his right, a dense bank of cumulus clouds was rolling off the water, generating strong, localized updrafts. It was a desperate gamble, using only the rudder to minimize drag. Yeager skidded the heavy Mustang toward the cloud bank. Slipping beneath the edge of the dark clouds, he felt a violent shove from beneath the wings. The thermal caught the plane, arresting his descent. He rode the invisible elevator of rising air for a precious 2,000 feet. He repeated this maneuver across the channel, hopping from cloud to cloud, bleeding altitude in the gaps, and clawing it back in the violent updrafts. After 30 minutes of agonizing gliding, the horizon finally broke in a ragged, brilliant white line. The white cliffs of Dover. He had crossed the water, but he was out of altitude, crossing the coastline at barely 500 feet. To his right, he spotted the massive runway of RAF Manston, an emergency diversion field. He banked gently toward the concrete, coming in dead stick with no engine power. At 200 feet, Yeager pulled the heavy lever for the landing gear. Nothing happened. The hydraulic system was completely empty. 50 feet above the runway threshold, traveling at 140 miles an hour, Yeager reached blindly behind the stick for the emergency manual blowdown valve. His thick gloves made it impossible to grip. Clamping his teeth onto the fingers of his right glove, he tore it off and grabbed the cold metal handle with his bare hand. He yanked upward with a desperate heave. With a deafening crack, the valve released. The left gear locked down, but the damaged right gear hung loose. Glamorous Glen 3 hit the concrete with a bone-shattering impact. As the weight settled, the unlocked right strut collapsed. The heavy wing dropped violently, slamming into the runway at over 100 miles an hour. A massive shower of bright orange sparks erupted as friction tore into the metal. The Mustang was thrown into a terrifying high-speed ground loop, spinning 360 degrees before shuddering to a halt just feet from the runway overrun. Yeager ripped off his mask, threw his weight against the canopy release, and hauled his battered body over the side. He scrambled away from the smoking wreckage. Within seconds, crash tenders surrounded the plane. A military ambulance screeched to a halt nearby, and a British Army nurse named Margaret sprinted across the tarmac toward him. She dropped to her knees beside the exhausted pilot, rapidly checking him for major bleeding, while wrapping a thick blanket around his violently shivering shoulders. Yeager looked past the nurse at the ruined carcass of his Mustang. He was finally home. Charles Yeager's 26-minute fight over the German countryside remains one of the most astonishing feats of aerial combat in military history. Statistically, surviving a solitary engagement against 6 heavily armed, coordinated enemy fighters while flying a critically damaged aircraft is a near impossibility. Yet, Yeager didn't simply survive the trap. He aggressively dismantled it through a combination of raw, mechanical intuition, unmatched situational awareness, and a terrifyingly cold, calculated courage. This singular dogfight cemented his reputation within the 8th Air Force, not just as an ace, but as a pilot who possessed an almost preternatural understanding of aerodynamic limits. The grueling physical and psychological endurance he forged in the freezing, shattered cockpit of glamorous Glen 3. That winter afternoon would serve him well in the years to come, laying the exact foundation of nerve and skill required when he stepped into the Bell X-1 to shatter the sound barrier.